Thank you, Bill, very much for that very gracious introduction. And thank you, Caverly and Pat, for having organized this. And if we can have the lights off, that would be perfect. Okay? All the lights off here. So Bill wanted me to talk a little bit about World Heritage status, since I was involved with developing very closely involved with developing World Heritage status for several sites in the Altai Mountains. Can you people hear me? I have a very bad voice. After 47 years of lecturing, I lost it. Okay. Okay. So what we're talking about is what we call a serial nomination for a World Heritage listing. And it was, we worked on it for several years. It came about, finally it was accepted in 2011. And by serial, we mean that it's more than one site. The World Heritage doesn't do serial nominations very often, but we were lucky to get this one. And it's made up of 3 sites. One is the one up the north, Sagan Sala Bagoygor, Sagan Go, and Aroltalgoy. This gives you a sense of what the size is. This is what we did up for the nomination. I can't think in terms of hectares, so I changed it into acres, and this will give you a sense of the size of the acres. So it's also, you can see that the 3 sites are way up against the border with Russia and China, right there where the high Altai Ridge is located. Now there are just a few other Mongolian World Heritage sites. We have the Ufsnor Basin, which is a transnational basin property up here. We have the very famous Ohan cultural landscape in the middle of the country. And the most recent World Heritage site is this one here, the Great Burhan Khaldun mountain and surrounding sacred landscape. And I'll be referring to that a little bit later, in part because I was also involved in that. But you can see there our Altai study area is. By comparison, Mongolia has 4 now, so China has 50 properties. It's been very aggressive in getting properties. France and Italy both have a great number, but then you have a place like Afghanistan with simply 2, and one of those, of course, has most tragically been destroyed. So there's a great variety, and there are reasons for that variety that I will talk about more later. Now let me just say that when we went into Mongolia, we had absolutely no intention of going for a World Heritage nomination. We were there just to actually survey. We've been working in the Russian Altai. We were there to survey for rock art particularly, although it broadened out after a certain amount of time. And it was, I'll get to this, but it's only after a certain number of years that we realized we had identified complexes of such extraordinary quality that we had to move to find protection. Okay, so what's the advantages of a World Heritage nomination? Okay, first of all, the process itself, going through the process of the nomination is a real learning experience. You start to think about all the things that are necessary to make a complex or a site intelligible to very different audiences. The possibility of having consultation from what are called international experts who come in and tell you what sorts of things you should be considering, what sorts of things you should be talking about in your nomination document. Theoretically, of course, there's some kind of protection. It's just maybe the cachet of being a World Heritage site. But since there's very little money given to the country that is supporting this World Heritage site, and there's no money given for protection of any kind of a physical kind, that's minimal. But of course, there's international cachet. A World Heritage site is more likely to attract tourists, and that can be good as well as not so good. So one of the limitations of World Heritage status, well, as I said, the protection is very limited, if at all. And we've seen what happens when, in a case like Aleppo or Palmyra, where if people don't want to respect a wonderful site, they will simply destroy it. As I said, there's little or no financial support, and there's no teeth required of the country aside from a document, a management document. Okay. The official process for going about a World Heritage nomination is Basically, you have to ask or you have to petition the government to make a decision to propose nomination. The Mongolians are actually have been very good at that. In the past, they basically have organized themselves, various institutes and officials, to come up with nominations. UNESCO then has to accept the proposal to nominate. So that's a long process also. Then there has got to be, if they accept the proposal, there's a written preparation of the nomination, and that's an extremely complicated document. It involves an executive summary, it involves a narrative, which has to detail what it is, where it is, and why it is important. And that also has to include the state of the site, its comparison with other sites in the world, and a very, very detailed management plan. And then, of course, the additional thing is documentation, very rich documentation. And when you think you've got that all done, and you've handed it in, they say, you got to do this, so you have to do that. And it got to be a fairly, I'd say not tedious, but certainly demanding process with this rock art site. We did it, though, in I'd say a record period of time, but with the Burhan Khaldun nomination, it took us a long time. Finally, UNESCO accepts the nomination. You have that, the government has that now feather in their cap, and they have to implement the management plan and the other contingencies of that nomination. So let me say something about the properties, what we call properties in this serial nomination. And let me just also say that when we first went into Bayan Ulgi Aymak, we are the only people who knew anything about where rock art was. We started off by doing a survey, a very broad survey. The only people who knew were occasionally herders would say, well, there's a wall of deer images up there, or there's something over there. There was only one notation that we had about where a rock art site existed, and that was some notes that Erdene Bata, our colleague here, and our late colleague Bayar had made as they were going about Bayan Ulgi in their, was it 1990, Erdene Bata? 92, I think, looking for Turkic image stones, and he identified, or they identified, a cluster of rock art here. So we came to this particular valley, Tsakatsalabagoigor, and began to look. First of all, it's very close to the Altai Ridge. It's a very extensive conjoined valley. The site or the complex begins up here where you see these lakes, across this whole valley, on these hills, and then down, 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 all the way down here for several kilometers, all along the terraces and all along the slopes going up the mountains. So you can see it's huge, and it's a very isolated valley and very, as you can see now, completely treeless. However, certainly in the early Bronze Age, there was still mosaic forests on the slopes, and there were real riparian zones along the rivers, but that has now all disappeared. So that's the first property. The second, I should say also that there's another view. You can see the valley over here looking to the sort of the southwest, and with very well watered in good times, highlands that are rich pasture. And then the most significant thing for our purposes was that the outcrops, rocky outcrops, particularly on the north side of the complex, are where we learned we could find rock art, and we found it in abundance. And the rock art here is extraordinary quality. It dates from the late Paleolithic, as you can see up this one up here, possibly this one, through the Bronze Age, early Iron Age, and there are a few Turkic images, but not too much. To give you a sense of what the place looks like, this was the map that we submitted with the nomination. What you see in the red is the actual site itself, and then all of these sites also have to have buffer zones within which there can be no development of any kind. And you can superimpose our map, which is the study points or the clusters of rock art and monuments. You can see how it follows the same thing along here. Now, the second valley or complex we were looking at, became interested in, was that of the river Tsagango, which rises in the Tavanbogt, the very high ridge here at the corner of China, Russia, and Mongolia. And it streams all the way down to the east, where it joins the Great Holt River. And you can see from the study sites that there's actually a lot of archaeology along the bottom here, and then it gets very steady here, and after our complex begins quite about there, you can see it here, where we above the Bog Tsast Nor. One thing you can see about this valley also is that it is very much reveals its origins in glacial action, just as does Tsagatsalam Bakoikor. And in this case, looking up to what is the sacred mountain, Shigatairan, rock art all along the boulders on the valley here, not up the hills, they're too precipitous. And here is the map itself with the sacred mountain, two rivers, the Tsagansala, the Harsala, that join to make the Tsagango. And I think that there's a lot of actually, the significance of this site is related to these the mountain and to these rivers. And here you can see, again, rock art sites. So the valley itself, looking up the valley along the Harsala River towards Tavanvogt. And the rock art is scattered on outcrops and boulders all along the south side of Shigatairan and across the boulder-strewn river valley here. And then up less, but there's up the Tsagansala to the Tavanvogt. In this case, we have a rather different valley. Not only is it more completely reveals its origins in glacial action, but the rock art and the monuments are very much down in the bottom land in the valley, and very little up on the hillside. They're just too steep. And the rock art here is also amazing. The quality is extraordinary. It is probably maybe pre-Bronze Age, not as early as what we have at Tsagansala. Wonderful Bronze Age material, and then very fine concentrations of Turkic material. So this valley offers a little bit different from this complex is a little bit different from Tsagansala. Now the third property is that of Araltalgoy, which has already been mentioned by Bill and by Richard today. And Araltalgoy is at the west end of Hotonor. Seen from the east, you can see that it's a low hill, looks like a whale, a low hill set against Ulan-Ul, and then the high mountains in the background. And seen from the west, it's just a low hill, partially now forested, within an area that is still has remnant forest remnant from the early Holocene. And this is the map that we used for the nomination. As you can see, here's the small boat-shaped hill with the larger buffer zone here. And the rock art is concentrated on about 27 or 30 outcrops along the hill. The outcrops are extremely badly damaged, but the material here is, I think, some of the most important material in all of North Asia. It's the largest collection of, or a concentration of imagery, open-air imagery from the late Pleistocene and early Holocene. And we find animals there such as rhinoceros, ostriches, and extraordinarily old images. But you can also see that the rock is very badly damaged from where the glacier came over and crushed, polished, and left these lovely surfaces to be carved. So a little bit about the chronology of our project. As I said, we went into Bayan Ogi with no intention whatsoever to find the material for a World Heritage Site. We didn't even know we were going to be concerned about preserving. We just were looking for what was there. And we started looking in 1994, And we continued to look and to record through to 2004. That was the first phase of our project. The second phase of my project was the 2004 to 2010. And it involved somewhat different personnel in both cases, okay? But we moved from a survey of, an initial survey of 94 of Tsagan Salabagor, then moving on to Tsagan Gol, and our hotel Goy is we would spend several weeks working at one complex and then go and do some more survey in other areas. And as we were working along, we realized, and this came to be the case particularly by the year 2000, that we had to do, especially with Tsagan Salabagor, with a complex that absolutely needed to be preserved. None of the local herders were particularly concerned. Nobody else seemed to be particularly concerned. It was an extremely remote area, but that this had to be preserved for future generations. And that's where we started to think carefully about how to go about this, how to organize this. In the succeeding years, we also published a number of documents, a serious, pretty comprehensive documentation of these three sites. And beginning in 2007, started to work on the written formulation of the serial nomination. In 2010, we submitted it to UNESCO, and 2011, it was accepted. So our first writing of this nomination, I think, was pretty successful. And I think that it was successful in part because we had actually done things right when we were doing our initial survey and documentation. As it turned out to be good. And that involved actually, first of all, identifying the site of the complex. Bear in mind that these places were not known. There were no tourists here. The only notice we have of any of them was what we had from Erdenibata and Bayar, and from local herders, okay? So we would first have to define whether it was a site or a complex, and I'm not going to go into the difference of that now, okay? Then we had to do documentation, and the documentation in this case was both visual, locational, and physical. And by that I mean that we drew, but we also photographed extensively. My husband and I walked this whole site back and forth, photographing every single surface that we could, and documenting where it was, using GPS to document where it was, where the concentrations were. And with that, we were able to then build the maps that I'll be talking about in a moment. There follows, of course, the preliminary field analysis, where we paid particular attention to style and subject matter, and using the maps that were based on, thematic maps based on our database. And noting things like physical setting, stone, orientation, viewshed. I myself am extremely interested in the relationship of archaeology to the larger landscape, and have spent a lot of time working on that. So this is some of the things that we noted here. And this is a lovely stone that was magnificent, big stag. You can see that the stone is oriented out to the south and to this ridge of Taldagini. Let's see here. So the process of preservation, the second part was development of supporting data, and this was really what we did in the laboratory, organizing and transcribing, correcting our database, or the field gathered materials for the database, developing that database, and it was quite an extensive thing. And then developing what we call the visualization through mapping of all kinds. We wanted people to be able to look at this material and begin to understand something about the value of the material, its relationship to the landscape, and not just what we saw, but what you would see from it looking out. That, to me, was a very important thing. So that involved then the development of secondary analyses of the visual materials, including images and site locations and what. And I should say something. I did most of this work before there were all these technical aids. Okay, so we had some fairly old material to deal with, or to use, but one of the things I was able to get from a colleague in Mongolia, in Ulaanbaatar, was a wonderful set of Soviet period aerial photographs of the Bayan Ulgi, the western edge of Bayan Ulgi. And with that, we were actually able to see where there were certain concentrations of large monuments And we were able to use that then to build a 3D model, such as you see here for Tsakan Sala, Mongolia. Now, all of these elements that we were doing, all these things we were doing in order to understand the site. We were doing it in order to understand the relationship of images of a particular period to the larger landscape, to elevation, for example. And as it turned out, it became very important supporting material for the nomination. So, in the case of Upper Tsakan Gol, this was also true, where we had to divide the sites or the complex into different concentrations. It was very hard to figure out how to organize this so we could find everything again. We had to find each section, and then we had to find the panel in the section. But in the process, we also then did thematic mapping of carts, in this case, carts and caravans. And here, this is for various surface monuments. And what has interested me here, of course, is the relationship of this material to the large mountain, Shidat Haikhan. The third part of our process of preservation, and again, we didn't do it for the nomination, but it turned out to be very useful for the nomination, was basically our analyses that we published, and most particularly the large books, at least for the two large sites, which were a pretty thorough documentation of Tsakan Salabagoigor and Tsakan Gol, and then a third smaller book that was published in Mongolia on Untitled Chapter. We also tried to developed an understanding of the relationship of the imagery to paleo environment, and that involved a lot of research. Okay, the fourth part of the process of preservation was really gathering a governmental support, okay? And I think that here, the person who really sparked this was my colleague, Sevan Dorj, and he was the one who really began to discuss this with Mongolian authorities, getting this nomination going for at least for Tsakan Salam Mongolia. But at a certain point, it was taken over very much by another individual, Ortnasan, who was the head of the Mongolian UNESCO mission. And with his help, we were able to identify appropriate agencies for preservation, to charge with public education, development of management plans, and finally the archiving of all relevant materials, which has not yet happened. But so actually there is on the management plan, it's really good. The written management plan, the extent to which it's been actually carried out is, I think, a question in part because of money. Okay. The last part of this process involved the preparation of the written nomination. And I have to say that's where I came in very, very heavily in this particular site. So there's this long narration and the justification. Now, UNESCO has a number of criteria that at times I thought I was going to pull my hair out, okay? So they want a justification for the inscription of each property. And we finally came down to, for all three of them, they represent a masterpiece of human creative genius. Okay, don't laugh, it's true, okay? The second part is for Tsakan Salam Mongolia and Tsakan Gol. They exhibit an important interchange of human values over a significant span of time. And the reason why we did that was they both demonstrate a considerable relationship with rock art on the western side of the ridge into the Altai Republic, into Kazakhstan, and then to the north in Tuva. So you can see in this rock art signs of the movement of people. And in the case of Tsakan Salam Mongolia and Altai, they bear a unique, or at least exceptional, testimony to cultural tradition that has disappeared. And they both have a very rich set of images, or a concentration of images that come from the late Pleistocene, early Holocene. Another criteria that they wanted us to consider, or you have to consider, is the authenticity and integrity of the properties, of course, whether this has been damaged in any major way, whether action has been taken to detract from the expression of outstanding universal value, and almost in all the cases at that time, the properties were really in good shape. Now, yes, there were people who had come and made their scrawled their John Hancocks, But in general, aside from the wear and tear of time, and it was considerable, the properties are remarkably intact, so we felt good about that. Now, UNESCO always asks for a statement of outstanding universal value. Stop and think for a moment. What would you say is the definition of outstanding universal value? This is where everyone gets caught up. So we finally actually worked it through, and fed it back to them, and they fed it back to us. The problem is that we're talking to, in dealing with UNESCO, you're talking with a group of very fine experts, but people who are trained to think and to see in Western European terms, okay? And we don't have any wonderful Renaissance images here. We don't have any wonderful Baroque buildings here. So getting them to understand what was actually of universal value here was quite a trick. And I'm not going to read it. You can see right here that we came up with a number of these criteria. And then finally it's saying that by virtue of their isolated settings, their location with a long border zone, and their partial inclusion in a national protected area, that's the Altai-Tava protected area. These properties have suffered relatively little human impact over the years. In this respect, the rock art and surface monuments in these properties are in excellent state of preservation in comparison with all other major known North Asian rock art sites. And that, I'm sorry to say, is true. Those that exist, and there are huge numbers in the former Soviet Union or in Kazakhstan, are very badly damaged. We had to talk a little about the factors affecting the conservation of the properties, and then develop very much the protection and management of the properties. And then finally, discuss the policies and programs for presentation and promotion of the properties. Now, comparative, another thing they want is a comparative analysis, not only what can you compare it to in Mongolia, but in North Asia and in the world as a whole, okay? So within North Asia, there is no other rock art site that compares in terms of its size, its quality, I believe, size, its quality, the lack of damage. There are others that are just as big, possibly, up in the Khakassia area, but very badly damaged. So in that respect, we say we could compare it to a site such as Beirut, but Beirut hadn't been published by then, so we did publish sites. The only other world rock art site, World Heritage Rock Art site, is at Tangali in Kazakhstan. And that's a much smaller site. And it's located near a population center, Almaty, and so they've been able to provide for easy tourist access, and they have provided a nice walkway and a visitor center there. In global competitors, I'd say that on the large side would be Val Camonica, which is a very major world rock art site, as you know, in northern Italy. Very well managed, existing for a long time. But just for comparison's sake, let me just say, compare us to Alta, which is totally different. Alta, you might say, is the example of a gem of a rock art site within a country that is highly civilized and everything is in good order. So Alta is in the far northern part of Norway, and the site itself is at the end of this fjord, beautiful rock outcrops, and it's very close to a population center, a significant one, Alta. So Alta has been able to make use of this site for tourism, for teaching kids, for all kinds of reasons. And they went so far as to build a very fine visitor center and museum. The material there at Alta is interesting in its comparison to ours. It dates from about 5000 BC to the late 1st century BCE. And it's primarily, as you can imagine, sea animals, sea birds, fish, reindeer, bears, boats, and humans. So it's much more limited in age and in, let's say, subject matter, but it's a beautiful site. And one of the things that I really loved about it was that they have these find walks where they control the way people walk. And here are some of the images. Now, I just want to say that while we were working on this site, another Norwegian colleague, not Knut Helskog, who was in charge of this, but another one who had worked on rock art sites, said that we really need to build for our rock art site, we had to have walkways. Like, think about the size of those two big sites. And imagine a walkway. As the blizzard is coming down and as the wind is coming down, and of course the herders have much better use for the wood and the metal than using them for walkways. So ours was a totally different kind of site. This is in some ways an ideal, but in Mongolia we have only very large sites, and we had to deal with that. So I just want to acknowledge a number of institutions and people who have been of great assistance to us in our work and in the preparation of this nomination. I want to single out for particular mention Nora Ortnason, who has been an absolutely driving force in the development of this and other World Heritage sites. I'm going to take a couple of minutes. I'm just going to say something about comparing this, contrasting this with the other site with which I was involved, Burkhan Khaldun. And I was involved in that by Ortnason wanted me to help him write it. The problem with Burkhan Khaldun is that it's a very complex site. It combines sacred mountain cults, the birth of Genghis Khan, birthplace of Genghis Khan, Lamaistic Buddhism, and shamanism, and in some very rich Mongolian fabric, but one which the Western European experts could not understand. They could not understand it. So we wrote and rewrote. It's also a very large site. We wrote and rewrote. We excised, we twisted, we pushed, pulled, and it finally went through this last year, much to the great pleasure of Elbeg Dorj, President Elbeg Dorj, and many others. But in that case, what did not exist, I think, was the kind of basic documentation and groundwork that we were able to develop for our rock art sites. It would have been much easier to have done Burkhan Khaldun had we had that kind of material. But in any case, live and learn, right? Thank you very much.
Very nice.
It's
of course, this never would have happened without your shepherding the process right from the start.
Right, it's true.
So
actually, I have to say
that
it's
is
true.
a key factor in all of this success, I think.
Yeah, it's true.
And, you know, it's no surprise that it went through so well.
Well, thank you.
Right from the beginning, the field
Thank
research, the management, your energy that went into it.
Thank you. But I just want to say, Bill, that actually the sites taught me how to look, how to see, and how to document. And that's a fact. So my gratitude is, in a sense, to that incredible material that I had the privilege of documenting.
It starts there, but it was there a long time before you got it.
It was.
And
Yeah.
you managed to have it happen.
I was lucky.
So,
I was lucky.
You.
Esther, have you monitored these sites after they became better known to see what happened to them?
We haven't. I personally have not monitored them, and I'm not going to monitor them. Okay. There are other people who are doing it theoretically on the IMOC level and on the IMOC level. I am not going to do it, in part because, first of all, I'm too old to go back and live in that very harsh country and work the way I'd like to work. And secondly is I'm very afraid of seeing the destruction of something I can do nothing about. It's really up to the Mongols at this point.
And what are the reports that you got?
The only problem I found is that I did go back a few years ago, and I did see there was one important surface that has 740 images on it, one surface, and it had been quite marked up by some visiting tourists. But otherwise, I'd say things looked in good shape. Okay, so in 2013, I think I was there, I looked at it. Yes.
Thanks. I was just wondering if you could speak at all about the Orkhon Cultural Landscapes site, and I think that's an interesting case because it is like sort of in the middle of a lot of the population of Mongolia, but I don't know of any tourism that's going there or really any infrastructure for it either.
I think I'd have to turn that over to Bill Honeychurch or Josh. Bill, can you talk about that, the Orkhon cultural landscape? I think that UNESCO's been very troubled that it hasn't been maintained better.
I can't say that much about it.
Josh, how about you, Bill? Do you know? No, I'm afraid I can't answer you. I'm sorry.
I mean, I've heard that people are like floating on the river and that there are some things like that, but yeah.
Well, floating on the river is not going to hurt anything, but if they do other things. Yeah.
I'm just wondering, any chance of having Bilut somehow seamlessly added to this serial nomination?
Well, we've sort of thought about that in casual conversations, and I doubt it would be possible. Because it's no longer unique, okay? That's the problem. It's these criteria that they constantly ask you to do. Why is it unique, okay? And I'd say Bilut is very close to our two big sites. But it's possible that through another means, because it is such a rich site, and in a somewhat different geophysical situation, it could be given IMOC-wide or even federal recognition. I don't know. I don't know if Richard, or Bill, you've discussed this or looked into things about that at all.
Oh, from the conference last spring, it was a conference that was initiated by. There was a conference in Ulaanbaatar last May, June, which Esther and Bill and I were invited to, and 12 or 14 other international rock art researchers to showcase especially Mongolia's rock art. And it was initiated by the President's Office and UNESCO. And we had some discussions with Badark, who was the UNESCO representative, and he left several of us with the impression it would not be a difficult thing to have it included serially with the others.
Somebody would have to do that whole writing about that. That is, you have to do it.
Yeah.
It's not an automatic thing.
Yeah.
Yes?
It is a slightly different subject, and it's more like the honor of your sensibility. How could one tell to the young students
About that?
about this sensibility of
Okay.
looking into?
Well, I'll tell you, I'll confess. I'm involved in a very big book project right now. And what I'm trying to do is using with a considerable number of photographs, trying to evoke the texture of life in the Bronze Age. And that if I could get this done, this would be a wonderful documentation for anybody to use. I think it'd be a wonderful way to get young people to look, get adults to look. But I have to get that done. It could be done, definitely. Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, yeah. Yes.
Clarification, so the UNESCO rules are that a site has to be not damaged and good condition, otherwise they won't protect it.
It's got to be not majorly damaged if they've already been mined, if it's already been mined. For example, there's been an enormous amount of damage to the rock art of the surface monuments. If it's been completely overrun by whatever, no, they won't, because they want something that has integrity. Okay. Okay. Like, it's pretty late. Yeah.
It's getting to be the witching hour.
Yeah. Thank you. Yeah.
Do you have a question?
Thank you for this great presentation and congratulations again. But from what I understand, however superficially, whenever a property is, designated as a World Heritage Property, right? People get into the dilemma of on the what? There's a dilemma involved in this recognition. On the one hand, you have, the legitimacy to really impose a much more rigorous protection of the site.
Right.
But on the other hand, if it's very successfully protected and promoted,
Yeah.
and you got tourists,
Yeah.
and then you got all the things that come with tourists,
Right.
and then just this is
Well, yeah,
universal.
Yeah, but there's a certain amount of, one of the things that I like about these complexes is that there's a certain amount of safety in benign neglect.
Right.
They all exist in very remote valleys where the weather is horrendous,
Right.
a large part of the year. They cannot build tourist camps or hotels or new roads in the buffer zone. So you'd have to walk or else go in a little car, and you could do that. And there are no nice little paths to tell you which way up the hill that way or that way, and where did she say that one was? You couldn't do it. So the nice thing is that it would be hard, it would be difficult to ruin it, but it could be done.
Yeah, Beirut is quite different because it's much more accessible to traffic. There's an army base there. There are a lot of tourist facilities. There will be more. The sites are pretty accessible, and they're, as Richard showed you, there are animals climbing up on them all the time. But it offers an opportunity, is that that's where people go. So there is the possibility of a ranger station there. There's more possibility for rangers to be appointed, who could guide people and so forth. So, this is the flip side of the problem. You've got, beautiful material. It's much more accessible and more endangered for that reason. And then from the deerstone point of view in that part of the world, we have the added complexity that for many years, and increasing now, people are just really marking up these stones because it's so easy to do. It's just like a slate, like a school slate board sitting there for people to scratch. And if you go to the central part of Mongolia, those deer stones are really in beautiful shape for the most part because they're made of granite or basalt, and people really can't very much, do much to them. So there's some really big differences there. I see a yawn. Okay, I think we're probably done now. Thank you, Esther, a wonderful presentation.